All right, so today we're going to look at the evolution of populations. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species, and it's really the smallest unit that we can really intensively study to see the mechanisms and the workings of the process of evolution. It's based on two ideas. So natural selection, that is differential survival. So like we talked about, organisms that have traits that are better suited to deal with and to survive in their environment will be able to have more offspring and pass those traits on more successfully than organisms that do not. And then genetic variation, that the gene makeup of a population changes over time and favorable traits become more common. So if there is a group of organisms and a certain trait is better able to allow organisms that possess that trait to survive in the environment, those organisms will be able to have a better chance of growing to sexual maturity and to have offspring and pass on that trait. And then over time, that trait will become more common within that population. So here are some pictures, for example, bent grass, that are on toxic mine sites, so they're able to exploit space that other organisms aren't because they are able to grow on this toxic environment and be able to have substrate without competition. Rock pocket mice in the desert lava flows, that's something that we're going to watch in class this next time, so we'll learn a little bit more about that. Insecticide resistance in insects. So we spray crops with insecticides to prevent them from being eaten by pests, and some of those have developed insecticide resistance, which over time is becoming more common because the only organisms or insects that are able to survive in those environments would have the trait and would be able to pass them on. All right. Also, kind of think about the wide variation in traits among the human population and how different traits under different circumstances have been selected for. And we kind of talked about, as an example last time with stabilizing selection, the idea about birth weight in in pounds and how that affects the the mortality rate and how a average birth weight has been established because of selection, because of stabilizing selection in the human population. So one thing we really want to make sure we get clear, and I reminded everybody about the end of last video, is what fitness means. So survival and reproductive success is our definition of fitness. So individuals with one phenotype that leave more offspring are considered more fit than the others. So here we have graphs that illustrate body size and egg laying in water striers. And on the x-axis, we have a length of adult female water striders, and on the y-axis, we have number of eggs laid per day. And we can see that larger length of the water strider results in more eggs. So we would say one that is able to lay more eggs would be more fit, and by extension, ones that are larger are more fit in this situation. In the other, we have length of adult female water strider and the lifespan. And we see that as the length goes up, the lifespan goes down. So in this example, we would say that maybe the larger ones are less fit. So it's never as cut and dry as using one piece of data. What we'd really want to look at is this graph right here where it says number of eggs laid during a lifetime versus length. And here we see that we have kind of an optimal length of around 14 millimeters. So another example of stabilizing selection. All right, we can say here now, based on the aggregate data, that the closer a water strider is to about 14 millimeters, the fitter it is because it's able to maximize the amount of eggs that it lays in its lifetime. Reproduction and passing on your genes, like I said, is the most important thing for fitness. So variation and natural selection. So there have to be differences within a population, right? If the whole population was completely the same, there wouldn't be anything for natural selection to act on. So some individuals must be more fit than others just based on random variation within the gene pool. You can kind of see pictorial representations of variation, natural variation within a gene pool in these three pictures. So the idea is, where does this variation come from? So mutation or random changes in DNA, errors during mitosis or meiosis, or mutagens in environmental damage. It might come from random mating, so mixing of alleles together. Um, Random mating is a really important way that we get variation in a population. So when we have different individuals that aren't selecting mates, we have a recombination of alleles in new arrangements in every single offspring. So the offspring, just like you know, aren't exact copies of the male or the female parent. So we have new phenotypes, and that creates some new variation that evolution can act on. There are five main agents of evolutionary change that we're going to talk about. So the first one is mutation, that we started with, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and selection. So mutation increases variation, and new mutations are constantly appearing because of errors in DNA replication and transcription, and due to mutagens, because it changes the DNA sequence. It may or may not change the amino acid sequence like we've seen. It may or may not change the protein and its structure and its function, but it could. And in those cases when those changes are beneficial or help organisms survive, they could be selected for by natural selection. Gene flow is the second thing we want to talk about. So this is a result of movement of individuals in and out of a population. So when we have individuals move into new populations and out of old populations, we're mixing up the gene pool. We're getting new DNA into that gene pool, and we're making it fresh and new. So migration of animals or seeds and pollen distributed by the wind and insects. Um, and when we're looking at animals specifically, think about how air travel has radically changed how the human population has changed over time. Uh, we might be able to create subpopulations or cause genetic mixing across regions as people have families that are more and more diverse than they ever have been. We're reducing differences between populations, but also we're creating new novel recombinations of genes that present new traits into the population. Gene flow in human population is incredibly high today because of the increased air travel and the transference of alleles between populations is incredibly diverse. So the idea is that there is more natural variation for evolution and natural selection to work on, the more diverse a gene pool is. And with our ability to travel, the human gene pool is becoming exponentially diverse. Three is non-random mating or sexual selection. We talked about this at the end of last time. Uh, or how, not based on fitness, but based on attractiveness or desirability in attracting mates, different traits or phenotypes might be selected for. And we talked last time about the peacock, but all of these pictures do a really good job at distilling how traits that might not have anything to do with differential survival might be selected for based on their ability to attract a mate. 4 is genetic drift, which is basically the effect of chance events, and this is something you'll do in your homework for today. Um, Examples of genetic drift are the founder effect, where a small group splinters off and starts a new colony. For example, in this picture, maybe we have a gene pool that looks like this, and just based on random chance, two of the red birds ended up getting blown clear to an island in a storm. And so the population that would grow up on this island would have a completely different gene pool than the one on the large mainland. That's an example of a founder effect. Or another example of genetic drift is the bottleneck effect. So some factor like a disaster reduces the population to a really small number. And then the population recovers and expands again. So the idea is that the small number that the natural disaster would have reduced the population to would have a completely different frequency of alleles than the population to start with. And so just based on a random event, not differential survival, we would have a change or an evolution within that population. All right. So just to continue, especially on bottlenecking, bottlenecking is a really important concept in conservation biology of endangered species, because when we lose a lot of alleles from the gene pool, there's a high reduction in the variation and the adaptability of those organisms to new environments. And so when you have really endangered or critically endangered species, it's not just as simple as breeding them together to get things back into the wild, because of the reduced variation and adaptability within that population. So that's why if you're really trying to bring back an endangered species, you need to breed them with what's called an outcross with other individuals out in the native population that might not necessarily be exactly from the same population as those endangered species, just to add some robustness and variation in their gene pool so eventually they could survive on their own. And then we've already really talked about this natural selection. Um, And just to go through once again, this is the differential survival and reproduction due to changing environmental conditions. So climate, food source, predators, disease, or toxins. And the idea is the combination of alleles that provide the best fitness, so survivability to reproduce, increase the population over time, because those individuals will likely survive to mate and pass on their genes more frequently. So just to end again with a picture of the 5 agents of evolutionary change in population genetics.